So welcome today, and hope you are all well. So today we will focus on how to get started with the co-registration for UK REACH purposes and what are the requirements. And actually we will go into much more depth than just this. So actually we'll look at the whole co-registration process from start to finish. So today we have two presenters, myself, Fredrik Johansson. I'm a partner, head of sales at REACH Law. I'm a chemical engineer by background, have a background also more than 17 years in the field of EHS as well as chemical regulations thereof, and been at REACH Law since 2010. And as of late, well, a few years back in time, also be working a lot with UK REACH. And that's, of course, having this presentation for you today. So, Steve, do you want to give a short introduction to yourself?
Hi, my name is Steve George. I've spent 33 years in industry, with 10 years chairing the Aerospace and Defence Industries of Europe REACH Working Group. I joined REACH Law in October as a senior advisor and director of REACH Law UK Limited.
Thank you, Steve. Okay, some practical information regarding the webinar. So you will be able to send questions using the chat function in the at the right side of your screen if you're using the application. We will answer these questions as best we can at the end of the webinar, and we'll also answer some questions we received ahead of this webinar by email. And we will be providing a recording of this webinar by after this webinar. It'll be a link to this recording so you can have a look at that later on, and we may even post this on YouTube, on our YouTube channel. So we'll see how we end up, but at least you will get the link to the recording a few days after this webinar, so you can always visit the recording, because today will be a long hauler, I would say. So of course, also please feel free to send us feedback. We appreciate that very much, and that helps us develop our work and our content and so forth. So thank you for your feedback. So as mentioned, we have a fairly long agenda for today, so this will go over 60 minutes. So apologies for that to begin with. But anyway, we'll start with just a quick overview of REACH Law, what we do, and then we'll provide a UK REACH overview, as well as looking at what are the registration requirements under UK REACH, so give you an overview thereof. Then we'll dive deep into the co-registration world, if you will, of UK REACH, and go through several topics thereof. And as mentioned, we'll go into quite a lot of depth there. So this will be a fairly in-depth look at the co-registration process. Then we'll conclude with some action plans for co-registrants, as well as the conclusions for this webinar before heading over to the Q&A session, whereby, as mentioned, we'll try to answer all of the questions you have sent using the chat function and before this webinar. And this will be the final UK REACH related webinar in a series of 5 webinars that we've had during the first half of this year. Obviously, we will have a second batch covering the second half of this year to be published a bit later on. But as for now, this is the final UK REACH webinar before the summer holidays. Okay, so we'll start with a quick overview of REACH Law. So who we are, what we do, for those of you who may not know what we do and what type of services we provide. So we provide support services for REACH, so EU REACH, and REACH-like chemical regulations globally. So this encompasses UK REACH, obviously, but also the Turkey REACH regulation, which is called the KKD-AK regulation, which is already in force, and also regulations that are entering into force, such as the Eurasia REACH regulation, as well as the India REACH regulation. So today, obviously, we'll focus on UK REACH. So we provide REACH-like REACH consultancy services, chemical regulatory consultancy services for all of these regulations and more, and we do this from depending on the regulation, from the different offices that we have. For example, as Steve mentioned, he's from the UK office of REACH law. So through this location office, we provide only representative services in the UK, whilst then for EU REACH purposes, we provide only representative services, and all the rest of the services through our head office here in Finland. Whilst then in Turkey, obviously in Istanbul, we provide OR services and related services for the KKD, IK regulation and so forth. And we also have an office in both Russia and Moscow, as well as New Delhi in India, to provide equivalent services when those regulations has entered into force. So if we look at our UK services, obviously today UK co-registration will be in focus, but we also provide a full set of UK related or UK REACH related other services, such as, of course, well, only representation I mentioned already, but also the more demanding work such as lead registration, authorization, consultancy services, technical legal services, as well as CLP, UK CLP related services. But on top of that, also, for example, these deferred registration related type of services, meaning for these new substances, new registrations of existing substances, that we will actually also touch upon in this presentation today. And all related services such as inquiry, which we'll also look at a bit today. So we specialize in chemical regulatory compliance and sustainability. So that's what we do, that's our niche. And speaking of YouTube, in the beginning, we have a channel called REACH Law Talks. So we are posting videos there, and we'll actually in an increasing amount also start posting webinars there. So you will be able to actually look at these webinars and these recordings on YouTube in ever increasing fashion. So likely this webinar will also be posted there. So please, if you like it, please do follow us on YouTube. Okay, so that's it for me. To conserve a bit of bandwidth, I would just turn off my camera and hand over the speech to Steve, please. Just let me know when to change slides.
Thank you, Freddy. Now, I see from our attendance list that we have some returning friends and so many new friends as well. I'm going to go through this section really quickly because a lot of the detail will be covered by Freddy after me, and it's going to be quite a long one. So I'm going to keep this really quite short. I'm going to speed through with a very low level of detail. If you need to get more detail later, you can either look at one of our previous webinars, or you can inquire later, or see the material. But I'm going to give you a very, very high level overview of how UK REACH works. Thank you. Next slide, please. Right, first of all, UK REACH is real, unfortunately, perhaps. It came into force on the 1st of January. Next slide, please. Now, what is UK REACH? Well, UK REACH is defined by a series of statutory instruments which modify EU REACH. So EU REACH is, as at the 31st of December last year, is the base building block, and then the first statutory instrument amends that, and then the next one amends it further, and then the next one amends it further, and then the next one amends it further again. So essentially, it is an overlapping series of amendments. There is no consolidated text yet. The government do recognise that this is a priority. You might understand that with Brexit, there are many, many thousands of pieces of legislation requiring this sort of legal service, but unfortunately, this one has not yet happened, even though they recognise it is a priority. It is a separate system to the EU REACH, even if it is nearly identical. There are no links between the UK and the EU. The fact that something has happened within the EU has no credit within the UK system unless it is explicit within the UK text. So What is the UK text? How does it differ? Well, changes are really made only for reasons of governance because the decision makers are different, or to manage transition because companies are coming out of one system and into another. There needs to be some management to avoid supply chain disruption and regulatory non-compliance. Now, it applies to the UK as a whole. Most provisions are only applicable to Great Britain, that is the mainland. Northern Ireland continues to operate within the EU REACH system, but there are some aspects of UK REACH which do apply in Northern Ireland, which is why it's still referred to as UK REACH, not GB REACH, which many people like to use. But most of it is for Great Britain only. Next slide, please. The Health and Safety Executive is effectively equivalent to the European Chemicals Agency in the UK. The IT system being used by the HSE is called Comply with UK REACH rather than REACH IT, but it is broadly speaking functionally equivalent as a system. Next slide, please. Your role is important to understand in order to understand how you're affected by the UK REACH. If you were a manufacturer of chemicals within Great Britain, then you will remain a manufacturer of chemicals under the UK REACH system. If you were an importer sourcing from outside of the EU and European Economic Area, then you remain an importer under UK REACH. If you were a downstream user buying chemicals from the European Union, European Economic Area, or Northern Ireland, then you become an importer under UK REACH. Now, importers have obligations that you wouldn't have had before as a mere distributor or downstream user. That's really important to understand. Next slide, please. Only representatives are defined exactly the same as they are in EU REACH, that they must be a UK legal entity representing a non-Great British manufacturer, formulator, or article producer, in fact, from another country. The only representative will take on the importer obligations on behalf of their client, but they must have sufficient background and data to demonstrate the compliance. It will be the only representative that is visited by the competent authority in the case of an audit, and therefore you really want someone competent to undertake this role. Now, of course, REACH law, we view ourselves as competent. There are other companies in the game, of course, as well. Next slide, please. For substances already on the market and already registered under EU REACH, then there are deferred registration dates in order to allow the appropriate transition into the UK system over a period of time, starting with the most hazardous and the highest volume substances, which need to be fully registered in the UK system or fully grandfathered in the UK system by the 28th of October 2023. The next level of hazard or tonnage by 2025, etc., down to 2027 for the least hazardous and substances over 1 ton per year. Next slide, please. If you're going to rely on the downstream user importer notification route, by which a notification is made this year, allowing later registration, then it can only be done if the substance was being received by the UK company and in active trade during 2019 or 2020 only, the 2 years prior to the end of the implementation period. That is very clear in the legislation. So this is really, really important to understand. Bending of this rule in order to try and create active trade where there wasn't would be a non-compliance. And you know, we're happy to advise potential clients if their case applies in this, this rule applies or not. Any cases of supply which do not fulfill these requirements are new substances to the Great British market, but if they were if they were previously registered at all in the European system, even though then there is another route, which I'll refer to in a moment, called the new registration of existing substances. Otherwise, the first step must be to inquire, and secondly, to register before placing substances on the Great British market greater than 1 tonne per year. So because the UK was within EU REACH, new substances would have to be registered before being placed on the market. There is no relief from that by going to a UK REACH system. So there's no late pre-registration or late do-in or anything else like that. Next slide, please. So new registration of existing substances. So this is some companies that must register before placing on the UK market or the GB market, but first of all, it has already been registered in the EU system. So it's not completely unknown, but it is new to Great Britain and to that particular company. A new registration is necessary, but with the permission of the Health and Safety Executive, they may allow the deferral of the submission of the full information requirement to a later date. So essentially what you're doing is registering a partial dossier with the HSE approval. So that's new registration of existing substances. The first step must be an inquiry, and then HSE will tell you whether your inquiry dossier has been successfully submitted and whether the NRES process applies. But you still have to register. Next slide, please. Back to you, Fede.
Thank you, Steve. Okay, so now let's look at registration under UK REACH, the basics. So again, if you've taken part in our webinars in the past for this under the registration topic, then you will find these slides familiar. But for those of you who haven't, I will go through these fairly quickly so that we can focus on the co-registration part. So registrations under UK are the same as under EU REACH. So that means that all manufactured and imported substances to Great Britain at 1 tonne or more must be registered. Either they would have had to be grandfathered by the 30th of April deadline, or then they are so-called new registrations. The registration tonnage bands are the same as for EU REACH, and the registration types are the same. So either you have a full substance or you have an intermediate, either an on-site isolated intermediate or a transported isolated intermediate. If these are under strictly controlled conditions, then they can utilize lesser data requirements than the full substance. And the data requirements also increase with the tonnage band of the substance. So the joint submission concept, we'll look at this in more detail. It also applies in the UK, meaning that you have one lead registrant and 0 to many co-registrants as part of the same joint submission. So one substance and one registration applies also in the UK. Data and cost sharing must be fair, transparent, and non-discriminatory, and also information needs to be kept up to date and stored for at least 10 years in case of inspections, for example. So the deadlines applicable for UK REACH registration, as Steve already touched upon on the NRES substances, so the new registration of existing substances, then these do not have any deadline except that you have to register these before placing on the market. So POM is placing on the market in Great Britain. So it means that you, as Steve mentioned, submit a limited, or let's say not a complete registration dossier, a so-called deferred registration, and then you are able to start placing the substance on the UK market. However, you will, as part of this deferred registration, need to later on take part in the joint submission and update your dossier accordingly. We will not go into this in any great details in this presentation. Then the grandfathering deadline, so the notification deadline, so the first deadline, which was on late April this spring, it's already passed. So those companies who had to grandfather, so those were the GB held registrations, EU REACH registrations, those should have already grandfathered these into UK REACH. However, the next deadline applicable for most companies, I would say, as well as only representatives, is the upcoming downstream user import notification deadline, so the DUIN deadline. Then the subsequent registration deadlines depend on the hazards of the substance and the volume, annual volume of the substance. So the higher volume substances and the more nastier substances, if you will, have the first registration deadline of 28th of October 2023. And this means all these deadlines on the screen, it means that you would have to submit your dossiers by this deadline. So in practice, you need to submit your dossiers on the 27th, for example, for registration purposes. Then for the lesser tonnage bands from 100 to 1,000, it's the same October 28th, 2025. And then for the smaller tonnage bands, 1 to 100, it's all the way in 2027, October 28th. So when a substance is intended to be UK REACH registered by one or more companies, a joint registration and a joint submission of the core data is required. This means that you have a lead registrant that submits, for example, the endpoint data as well as potentially a chemical safety report, and this will be discussed in a few slides, and submits this on behalf of all the other registrants taking part in the same joint submission. So this so the core data is essentially the tox, ecotox, FISChem data for the substance in question. All registrants of the same substance need to agree on the data to be included in this joint submission, and it is possible to do opt-outs as it is for EU REACH, meaning that if some endpoints do not apply to your particular variant, if you will, of the substance or your users and so forth, then there is the possibility to opt out, albeit the process is likely to be fairly cumbersome as it is in the EU. So the lead registrant and the co-registrant form the joint submission, the joint registration group, and then later on when they submit a registration, they will form a joint submission. And all the data to be shared and cost to be shared in this joint registration effort needs to be fair, transparent, and non-discriminatory. So there, if someone mentions about sieves for UK REACH purposes, there are no sieves. They're called substance groups in the UK REACH. So we'll look at this in a few slides. So just to give you a visualization of the joint submission effort, so you have one lead registrant submitting the core data, and then you have the co-registrants taking part in this joint submission and sharing costs and data and so forth. And all of these need to be then submitted by the applicable registration deadline. Obviously, the lead registrant has to submit first, and they have to submit by the registration deadline that is the first for the whole substance group or this group of companies. So if anyone is at, for example, over 1,000 tons, then the lead registrant will also have to submit by this first deadline, so 28th of October 2023. And typically, the lead registrant also has the highest volume, obviously, also for these substances. But if you want to know more about the lead registration process, we had a previous webinar on this topic, so please have a look at that. If you don't have the link to that webinar, then please do send us an email and we'll share that link with you. So we look at the interactions between the different types of registrations. So we have the grandfathered registrations. So these registrations that had to be notified by end of April. The deadline has obviously passed. So these will have to take part in the joint registration effort. Then we have these new registrations, or sometimes called transitional registrations, so meaning these companies that are importers in Great Britain and, for example, UK based only representatives, they have to submit the doing notification by this 28th of October deadline this year, and then a subsequent inquiry before taking part in the joint registration. And also, just to highlight, we also had a separate webinar on the doing requirements. So if you also want to have that link, just let us know and we will share that link also, where we go into more detail on that. So today we will not look at the doing process because we have already looked at that. And then we have this new registration of existing substances, as Steve mentioned. So they will also need to take part in the joint registration after they have submitted an inquiry and this deferred registration that we discussed in brief. And all of these will need to cooperate in the joint registration effort for the purpose of developing this joint submission and sharing data, sharing costs, and of course compiling the lead dossier that will then eventually be submitted by the lead registrant, after which everyone else can then submit their co-registration dossiers. And co-registration dossiers will be the focus of this webinar. So all of these need the same access to the joint registration and related information. So for those of you who grandfathered in your UK REACH registrations, you will still have to take part in the joint submission effort. So that's good to know. So what this all looks like in practice is that, for example, if we start with the grandfathered registrations, so these once they grandfathered, did the notification by end of April, they were placed in this substance group. A substance group is a collection of companies who have either grandfathered or inquired for the same substance. So in essence, companies that are potentially looking to register the same substance. Then we have these companies who can take benefit of these transitional arrangements, like the doing notification and so forth. So once they submit an inquiry, they will also be placed in the substance group. Then we have these NRES cases, so the new registration of existing substance. They can also take part, and they have to take part in the substance group, and they also get access to the substance group after submitting the inquiry. So all of these actors need to take part in the joint submission effort, select the lead registrant, and then take this work forward and share costs and data. And all of this, when you eventually submit your own, for example, co-registration, which will be the topic of today, then depending on your volumes that you are, or the annual volume of the substance registration and the type of substance, whether it's full or intermediate substances, then these affect the total cost of the HSE registration fee. So for 1 to 10 tons per year, and for transported isolated intermediates as well as on-site isolated intermediates at any tonnage band, it's £1,138. An inquiry fee is non-existent, so that's free of charge. However, then for higher tonnage bands of the full substance, for a large company size, then the fees increase, and for the highest tonnage band, the HSE fees are comparable to the ECA fees, registration fees. Of course, if you are a small and medium-sized enterprise, you are able to get reductions in these fees. But if that is the case, you have to prove that you really are an SME to the HSE and provide documentary evidence and so forth. So that is a process in itself. So just wanted to highlight that. And grandfathered registrations that they were notified, for example, by this April 30th deadline, then these are considered as registered. So essentially, they do not have to pay this HSE fee again, because they paid the registration fee to ECA back in the day. Okay, so now we will go into the actual co-registration world, if you will, and look at several sections, subsections thereof. So we will start with a look at from a substance group to a joint submission. So how do I get to a substance group, and from there to a joint submission? So give you an overview thereof. Then we'll look at the co-registration. So what is that in essence? Then we'll look at the substance group activities to take part in as a co-registrant. Then look at also at the access to the joint submission. So this will be the letter of access part, and how to compile the dossier and submit it, as well as just an overview, holistic view of the total cost of co-registration. I will not provide any fees or any total sums. I'll just give you proportions of the different costs, just for you to get a sense of how the costs will distribute, if you will. So before you can actually start any registration work in the UK for UK REACH purposes, then you either had to grandfather the substance into a substance group, or then you submitted an inquiry and became a member of a substance group. And the inquiry is applicable to these cases where you are submitting a doing notification, so you are eligible to these transitory measures, but also for these NRES substance cases. So all actors in a way get access to the substance group through an inquiry or by grandfathering. And this grandfathering obviously is something that has already happened. In the substance group, then one lead registrant is selected and everyone else becomes a co-registrant, and the co-registrant is the one we are focusing on today. So for the inquiry, I will just show you how that's done, because that is a very important part of the registration process. It's a precursor to that process, because if you don't inquire, you cannot register, as mentioned. And it has to be concluded before you actually can submit a registration. So the purpose of the inquiry is just to verify the substance identity. So the HSE does this based on your inquiry dossier, and it's a precursor for the registration process of new substances, whether it's these NRES cases or these transitory cases, if you will. So all cases except these grandfathered registrations. The inquiry dossier must include enough information to allow for the correct identification of the substance by the HSE people who are actually reviewing this dossier. And the same guidance, same requirements, same strictness as apply for EU REACH also apply for UK REACH inquiries. So there will be as equally nitpicking on the information that is submitted in the dossier. So there are no quality downgrades in the UK. It's actually, they're using the same strictness and same guidance as EU REACH. Once you have inquired and you're inquired successfully, you will become a member of a substance group. In this substance group, you are then able to take the registration process further, as discussed earlier. And what this looks like in practice, now just looking at the submitting part of an inquiry, and we're not looking at the compilation of the inquiry dossier in iEuclid. We'll look at that for the co-registration file, but just wanted to highlight and show how you can actually take part in this substance group by submitting an inquiry dossier that was pre-compiled using iEuclid 6 format or later. So you cannot submit inquiry dossiers in iEuclid 5 format. So for example, if you inquired or submit if you have an inquiry dossier made in iEuclid 5, then you cannot submit that. You will have to recompile it. And in any case, you have to recompile any dossiers created for EU REACH to submit them for UK, because there are certain nuances in the technical compilation of the dossier. So once you have your dossier ready, you go into this comply with UK REACH system. Obviously, you need to have the login details for this, but these are available on the government site, where you can actually sign up for this comply with UK REACH system. We'll not go into details of that. We've covered that in a separate webinar also. You go to inquiry, and then to upload your inquiry Euclid dossier. So you choose your file and select continue. It will say that it has found a matching substance. If this substance has been, for example, someone else has inquired for it, or it's available in the INEX inventory or in this easy lists and so forth. Then everything is good, so you can just check that your inquiry is for the same substance. Then you select continue. You can give a submission name to the submission. This is just something that you will see in your IT system, so give a meaningful name. Select continue, and if you had a third-party representative, then you can add it here, but in this case we don't have this, so we select continue, and then you will get just a summary, if you will, of the inquiry for you to check details, so you can still go ahead and update this individual information if you need to do that. But if everything is okay, then you select submit, and you will get a notification that the dossier has been submitted successfully, if that is the case, and only once it has been processed by the HSE. And this may take a few days or even a week, maybe longer as time goes by and more companies are submitting their inquiries. Eventually, if everything is okay, everything checks out, then you will get an email from the HSE saying that this your inquiry has been accepted, and you can go in to comply with UK REACH the system and look at the substance group. And what that looks like is as follows. So you then open the inquiry file and click the substance name, through which process you will be able then to access the substance group. And this substance group is where you will see who else has inquired, who else has grandfathered or eventually registered substances, and so forth. So, and from this point on, you are also able to download the contact details of each and every other company who has inquired or registered or grandfathered these for this substance, and get in touch with them. And this is typically something that the lead registrant then will do to coordinate the registration work. Or if there is obviously a consortium, then they will do the work. So only after you've been accepted after submitting the inquiry can you become a member of this substance group, and actually the registration dialogue will be available in this comply with UK REACH system. So until then, if you have looked at your comply with UK REACH system, you have not seen this registration dialogue because you are not a member of substance group, so it's not available to you. But once you are, this dialogue will be available, and we will look at that in the coming slides. So once you have successfully inquired for the substance, then you will be placed in this substance group, as mentioned, where all other companies are present. There is no deadline for this, but of course, it is recommended to do this rather sooner than later. So inquire rather sooner than later, because if you want to, for example, take part in the lead registration selection or election process, then if you are not in the substance group, you will not be able to take part in this effort, for example. But when you are in the substance group, then the members of this group must also select a lead registrant and choose how to cooperate in the development of this joint registration dossier. There's no deadline for doing this either, but obviously the sooner the better. And then once a lead registrant has been selected, then the joint registration development process goes forward, and of course the lead registrant is the one who is a holder of this lead dossier, where all this information, core information, is included. Once everything is set and done, then this lead registrant will submit this joint registration to the HSE, and once that has passed all the checks, then the co-registrants can submit their own registrations as part of this joint submission. And the deadlines are, as discussed earlier, these are the registration deadlines. So the registration deadlines are applicable to you as a co-registrant. So depending on the substance type and depending on your annual volume. So for example, if you are taking part in a joint submission, and you have a non-hazardous substance, let's say any non-hazardous substance at 10 tons annually, then your registration deadline will be end of October 2027. So in this substance group, you need to select the lead registrant to take this joint registration development forward. And there is no process for this, except that it has to be self-organized in this substance group. So typically how this works is that someone who wants to become a lead registrant then issues or sends out an email to all the other members of the substance group, because this email list is available for download in the substance group, as we saw a few slides ago, and argues their case of becoming a lead registrant, saying essentially why they would be a good lead registrant and so forth. If there are 2 or more candidates for lead registrant position, then of course there has to be some sort of a election. And again, there's no formal authority for this. It's a democratic process, so whoever gets the most votes, supports from the other substance group members will become a lead registrant. And it's good to provide at least a 2 weeks time frame to conducting this type of a support, providing this type of a support for some company becoming a lead registrant. So for example, if we had 2 companies who say they want to become a lead registrant, typically one starts the process by saying, okay, we want to become a lead registrant. Does anyone have any objections? Then another company says, yes, we also want to become a lead registrant. And these are the reasons why we would be maybe a better lead registrant. And then it's essentially this other registrant, and both registrants should at least give 2 weeks notice time for the co-registrant, or sorry, the substance group members to voice their opinion on which company should become the lead registrant. So the company at the end of, for example, this 2 week time frame, who has received the most support will then become the lead registrant, and the lead registrant of course needs to just document this for future reference. So if you want to take part in this type of an activity, then you should definitely inquire as soon as possible. You can actually inquire before you even submit the doing notification. These are not directly linked to each other. But if you want to take part in the lead registration election process, and definitely if you want to become a lead registrant, you should inquire as soon as possible. And a good lead registrant is typically somebody who has is data rich, has maybe the highest annual volume, was also maybe the EU REACH lead registrant for the same substance, and and also generally just a serious player on the market. And it's good to know also and note that only representatives can also become lead registrants. And I would estimate that for UK REACH, quite a few ORs, only representatives, will actually become lead registrants, because these only representatives for UK REACH are representing, for example, non-GB based companies who were lead registrants for EU REACH purposes. This we are seeing happening, for example, in Turkey for KKD-IK purposes. And in some cases, we have industry associations, consortia, other types of groups of companies who are then also taking on the responsibility to develop the joint registration effort, this dossier. So in those cases, it may be that the lead registrant election or selection may be postponed to later. But I think as all data is most basically available already for the joint registration process from EU REACH, I think also the lead registrant nomination process will be initiated for most substances fairly early on, just to lock in the lead registrant position. Those can be changed later on if need be. Okay, so then looking at the co-registration, so giving you just the overview thereof. So what is a co-registrant? Sometimes these are also called a member registrant or a member registration as a co-registration. So we like to call it a co-registrant because I think it's a bit more describing the member registrant, because the lead registrant is also a member, I think, of the substance group. So co-registrant is responsible, obviously, for his and her own registration. They must anyway cooperate in the substance group to take the joint registration effort forward. And obviously, it is the lead registrant who coordinates the joint registration effort, but you need to take part in the data sharing exercise if applicable to you, and if you have data available to share, and you most definitely need to take part in the cost sharing exercise by then purchasing a letter of access, for example, to this joint registration, joint submission. Sometimes consortia, if you are a member of consortia, then you will not be granted a letter of access, because as a consortium member you might have direct access to the joint submission. But this is depends on the case at hand. Then you also have to compile and submit your co-registration as part of this joint submission, and submit this to the HSE using this comply with UK REACH IT system. And of course, do this before the applicable deadlines. These applicable deadlines that apply to your case, so your annual volumes and so forth. And then you also, as we've seen from EU REACH purposes, you need to keep this co-registration dossier up to date and keep records and communicate with authorities where need be and required. And of course, you may also be inspected for UK REACH compliance, and then you have to produce documents that you are in compliance with UK REACH and so forth. So record keeping is very important. So what does the co-registration dossier contain? So it contains the substance identity information, it contains company-specific information, and guidance of safe use, chemical safety report in some cases, and appendices. So the substance identity information includes own analytical information to prove that your substance identity. So essentially, this is the same information that you have submitted as part of an inquiry, unless the substance identity profile has since then been changed by due to a consensus to change the substance identity profile for whatever reason in the joint registration effort. Then company data, such as who is the manufacturing side? Are you manufacturing, importing? Are you an only representative? Information about users and so forth. We'll look at this in more detail when we look at the how to compile this co-registration dossier. You provide also tonnage information as part of this company-specific information. Then guidance of safe use and the chemical safety report is something that can be submitted by the lead registrant, but in some cases you will have to do this yourself. Sometimes, and I would say most cases, the lead registrant will provide you a template of the information to be submitted as a co-registrant when it comes to guidance on safe use and the chemical safety report, and you just essentially fill in company-specific information and include this in your co-registration dossier. But in some cases, it may be that even the chemical safety report is not covered by the joint submission, and then you would have to create this yourself, because it is not mandatory to cover the chemical safety report in a joint submission. Albeit in most cases it is covered in one way or another. For intermediates, you also need to provide strictly controlled conditions documentation, so-called Appendix 3 documentation. This is included in the appendix part of the dossier. Once this is all of this information is compiled, create a dossier, check that it is okay, and then go ahead and submit it to the HSE using the comply with UK REACH IT system. And we will look at this in detail in a few slides. So if we look at where we as co-registrants are in the whole lead registration process, and what parts of the lead registration process we need to take part in. Then obviously we will need to take part in the co-registration part, and we need to also take part in the communication by the lead registrant for the purpose of developing this joint submission. So this means communication regarding the substance identity profile, registration intentions, availability of data to share, users to be covered, classification and labeling information, then substance group agreement, so-called SEEF agreement in EU REACH. Then you need to take part in letter of access sales, and eventually also in updates and the communication thereof. So co-registering and taking part in the joint registration development process entails some work. Let's put it this way, especially if you want to take part and be more active in this process. Also, I wanted to highlight that as you have, most of you, I would say, have already in one way or another been touched by the EU REACH registration requirements and EU REACH in general, you can definitely utilize this know-how that you received and generated during the EU REACH registration part, and you can use that in your benefit, for the benefit of your UK REACH registration efforts. So for example, some consortia are extending the right to use EU REACH data for also non-EU REACH purposes. So this also encompasses UK REACH, also, for example, Turkey and so forth, Turkey, KKD, AK, and so forth. So this is good if you are a member of a consortia that does this. We know already of several consortia who have done this and are in the process of doing this. You may also yourself own or partially own data that can be used for these UK REACH registration purposes. So you do not have to pay for this information again. And this is information that you can share as part of the joint registration effort. And the dossiers you created, in this case, the co-registration dossiers that you created for EU REACH, can also function as a so-called a basis or a template for the UK REACH registration effort, because they are using the same tools, essentially, as we will see in a few slides. And of course, you can reuse company-specific information such as analytical information for UK REACH purposes. So I think this is a big win, because generating analytical information was sometimes a bit painful, if I recall the days of doing this for EU REACH, especially for a certain type of UVCB substances and so forth. And of course, you can also recap and utilize the learnings and the know-how from the EU REACH registration process, and you use that to your advantage. So you already know what the lead registrant is, you know what a co-registrant is, what a letter of access is, and so forth. So that's all information that you can utilize for UK REACH purposes. Okay, next, looking at some substance group activities to take part of as a co-registrant, and this is again, if you want to take full part in these substance group activities, then I suggest submitting your inquiries as soon as possible. Okay, so starting with the substance identity and agreement thereof. So these are type of communications usually initiated by the lead registrant. In some cases, it can be a consortium, but for this webinar, let's just talk about lead registrant initiating these. So substance identity and agreement thereof. So that is typically something that is initiated by, obviously, email, because there typically are attachments and information, rather complicated information to be shared by the lead registrant. So the idea is to define a substance identity profile in the substance group, and then stick to this substance identity profile for the joint registration. Albeit we are not expecting this to be a big hurdle, because we can use the same substance identity profile as was used for EU REACH purposes in most cases, I would say. In some cases, if the data is really old, it might be time to really then go ahead and update it to modern requirements, because the same requirements apply for UK REACH as for EU REACH when it comes to substance identity and so forth, and defining the substance identity. So you need to agree on this substance identity profile in this substance group. So it is very good that you make sure that your composition is covered. I would say it will be fairly in most cases, but still it is something that you need to check. Then the lead registrant will also come back to you and ask for availability of information, data to be shared, and they will provide information as to why what information specifically is needed and why this is important. You would need to, or the lead registrant will ask you as a substance group member to identify these relevant endpoint data and the studies that you own or have legitimate access to, part access to, for the purpose of using this data for the lead registration effort. They will ask you to also share the costs related to these endpoint data and studies. So if you have this information available, you can already start, or you know that you have it somewhere, you can already start compiling it to a nice folder for future use, for example, for UK REACH purpose. And this is something that the lead has to come back to and ask in the substance group. And if you have this information, you should definitely provide it, because obviously you do not have to pay for information that you have already paid for and you have available. So sometimes lead registrants can use an Excel file for this purpose, and this is, for example, something that REACH Law has used in some cases to collect this information from co-registrants in the substance group. However, it may look different depending on the lead registrant and so forth, and the substance, of course. Some endpoints are not applicable for certain substances and so forth. So a good lead registrant will, of course, just ask for the information where there are gaps and so forth. Then also the lead registrant will initiate communication related to collecting, let's say, registration intentions and related information. So they will ask who will actually go ahead then and co-register, for example, someone co-register in the substance group, because obviously it does not mean if you have inquired that you have to eventually register. So they will check this. They may ask you to indicate your role as active, passive, dormant. As we've seen in the past for EU REACH purposes, there are different roles depending on the lead registrant, but these are, I would say, fairly normally used in many cases. And it is good to understand that regardless of what your role is in the substance group, you will always, and you should always, get all relevant substance group communication in your inbox, for example, by the lead registrant. So they cannot, even if you mark yourself as dormant, they should not and cannot exclude you from future communications related to the joint registration effort. They will also ask type of registration, so full and intermediate, and also an estimated tonnage band for your registration. And they will utilize this for calculating the letter of access. Then at some point, they will also ask about what uses you would like to cover. And again, basically, these uses are probably going to be the same uses as were covered for EU REACH purposes, but nonetheless, they will need to inquire this, and maybe it will be a smaller subset of uses or more defined uses than for EU REACH purposes. This remains to be seen and is, of course, case by case dependent. Then they will provide information. The lead registrant should communicate information about which uses will be covered eventually once they've collected this and iron out the gaps, and also whether the chemical safety report and guidance of safe use will be covered by the joint submission, meaning that the lead registrant submits this information on behalf of the co-registrants. However, we've seen as of a few years back a trend in the EU that actually it will go so that the lead registrant and the joint registration effort will develop a template for both guidance on safe use and the CSR and distribute these templates in the substance group for each co-registrant then to specify for their own specific cases and submit them as part of the co-registration dossier. If new users need to be covered, then following information is required for the new use. So technical description of the use, data on the risk management measures and operational conditions, end of use information, and information on environmental emissions. So this is something that if additional users would have to be included beyond the ones that the lead registrant is communicating as part of this joint registration effort. But hopefully this you don't have to go into that much detail because your users will by default already be covered. But nonetheless, it's good to follow the process and make sure that your users indeed are covered. So not just your users, but if you are further supplying your substances as such as part of mixtures to your customers who use it differently, then those should also be covered. Then, of course, the lead registrant should also propose a classification and labeling for the substance, but this will be likely the same as for EU CLP, so the same classification as in the EU lead dossier. But there might be subtle changes as the process goes forward. So if you have input on this, then you should also communicate that as a co-registrant to the lead registrant. And eventually, a substance group agreement. So this is the equivalent to a CEF agreement in EU REACH, is something that will need to be developed. And this is something that each substance group member must sign who intends to then actually take part of the joint registration work. And this agreement is signed between the lead registrant and the co-registrant. Obviously, again, if there's a consortium, then it may be a bit different setup, but essentially in cases where we have a lead registrant driving the joint registration effort, then this is the way it's worked for EU REACH, and we will estimate it and anticipating it to work also for UK REACH purposes. So each registrant needs to sign this agreement separately. Then good to note that if a registration is done by only representative, then you will have to sign this agreement several times for each non-GB manufacturer formulating that you are representing. So you cannot just have one agreement for only representative covering many appointees, so to speak, principals. That is not the case. That's not how it works. So for each company representing a separate substance group agreement needs to be signed. And this agreement should also cover, amongst others, the reimbursement information. So essentially, when additional companies join the joint submission, how is the reimbursement, how will that work, and so forth. And then eventually, of course, the lead registrant will also provide information, communicate, and issue the letter of access. So obviously, this is something that you have to take part of, and we'll talk about this in more details later on in this presentation. And as said, we are going over the 60-minute mark 4 minutes ago already, so please bear with me. And of course, you are always welcome to look at the recording later on if you have to go. And of course, they will communicate on updates and to the joint submission and so forth. And this is something that will go on essentially for as long as the joint submission exists and where updates are needed. So it's recommended to follow the substance group communication and be active in protecting your own interests in the joint registration coverage and the whole process, obviously. So if you want to be active, we recommend that definitely. And this is something the way we work typically also as an only representative working to co-register, for example, our client substances. We tend to be very active as members of a sieve, but in this case, a substance group. So access to the joint submission, how does that work? So as mentioned, each co-registrant must obtain legitimate access to the information in the joint submission. So the lead registrant dossier that was submitted. Because this co-registrant need to refer to this information that is in the lead dossier. And of course, if they refer to this information, they also have to compensate for the work that was conducted in generating this information. So this, as it says in the regulation, data and costs need to be shared in a fair, transparent, and non-discriminatory way. So it means that the costs for developing the lead dossier and all the data, related data, is information that and activities that can be shared from a cost sharing perspective. The most common way and mechanism used for sharing this data and cost within a joint submission is that the lead registrant issues a letter of access against a fee, obviously, to companies wishing to then UK register the same substance, so become co-registrants. So essentially you have the substance group agreement, and then you have this letter of access which then provides you the right to take part in the joint submission. And this letter of access costs is something that typically have been, probably depending on the substance and the volumes, obviously, but typically have been something that is the most expensive, or at least part of the most expensive components of the whole UK REACH registration process. Obviously, if you're registering over 1,000 tons, then your HSE fee will be quite high, but I would suspect that depending on, of course, on the substance, the letter of access fee may also be high. But this is something to be developed, to be seen how the letter of access costs actually develop for UK REACH purposes. Obviously, the UK and the GB specifically, being a smaller market than the EU, I think it would be only fair to at least somehow reflect this also in the letter of access fees. The letter of access process is more or less as follows. So as we get closer to the completion of the joint registration, and when all the costs are known by the lead registrant, then this lead registrant, or in some cases consortium, issue this letter of access. Then the co-registrant should check that the letter of access is okay and covers your uses. And of course, this is something that you already know if you've taken part in the communication efforts during the joint registration effort, as we looked at previously. But you should select the letter of access that is applicable to your type of registration and tonnage band and so forth. And it's recommended to do this as soon as possible when the letter of access is available. And the lead registrant should definitely start issuing these letter of accesses at least 6 months before the first registration deadline of the joint submission. So once you have paid for the letter of access, the lead registrant will provide access to you, to your company, to the joint submission. And how this exactly works is still to be determined. It is not available yet, but we suspect that there will be some sort of a token type of a system whereby you get a code that you need to submit as part of your co-registration process. Maybe include this in the dossier or somehow include the code. Or then the lead registrant selects these co-registrants that are accepted into the joint submission. This is something that for example, the letter one applies in Turkey, for example. So we will see how this develops. But once you have access to the joint submission, you should do this as soon as possible, and then eventually, obviously, submit your co-registration as part of the joint submission. Now, why you should join the joint submission as soon as possible is because, especially in the case where they're providing tokens, these tokens tend to expire within a month's time or so. But this, as mentioned, needs to be determined as we go forward. The mechanism is not entirely clear yet. So once you have submitted your co-registration, you pay the registration fee, and of course this is something you should do in good time before the registration deadline, which is applicable to you. And as discussed already, partly certain information is always included in the letter of access. Some information is optional to be included in the coverage of the letter of access. So always included information is like information on the composition of the substance, so that you know that you're fitting into the boundary compositions of this joint submission, identified uses, classification and labeling, and so forth. This is typically information that is the same for all registrants. Obviously, co-registrants may have a smaller set or subset of uses, but nonetheless, these should be defined by the lead registrant, by the joint submission, and should always be included as part of the package you're receiving as part of the letter of access. However, optional coverages, as discussed already, will be the chemical safety report and guidance of safe use. So obviously, our recommendation is that early in the joint registration process, when you are communicating with the lead, just make sure that they will stop from the start, take this under the coverage of the joint submission and under the coverage of the letter of access, meaning that they will at least provide then a CSR template for the co-registrants to fill in with company-specific information and submit as part of the co-registration dossier, if not provided by the lead registrant. And the same goes for the guidance of same use. So be careful with just making sure that you are getting coverage for what you need in the letter of access. And good to know that you, of course, only have to pay for data that you actually need for your registration. So you do not have to pay for this data if you already own it. So this we suspect that there will be a bit of recalculations needed depending on the co-registrants going forwards, because some may, due to having EU REACH registered, may own some information themselves, so they obviously do not have to pay for that information as part of the letter of access purchase. So we suspect that there will be the need for the lead registrant to customize the letter of access issuance to some degree, depending on the need of each co-registrant. But this is something that we will see how it pans out, and in any case, it has to be fair, transparent, and non-discriminatory. So now, looking at the registration dossier compilation and submission. So as for EU REACH, the UK REACH dossiers, including the inquiry and the registration dossiers and more, actually will need to be prepared using this iEuclid software. And this iEuclid software is something that you can download for free on the iEuclid website, and it's used in many different chemical regulations for storing, maintaining, exchanging data on intrinsic and hazardous properties of chemical substances. So for example, it's obviously used for EU REACH purposes, but it will also be, and it is used for UK REACH, but also for biocides product regulation and CLP and poison center notification, even for skip notifications and so forth. So if you want to know more about the software, download it, then you can go and visit the link on the page. So provided you have downloaded the system or using it as a web-based system, which you will see actually on the screen, because this is the system that REACH Law is using, because we're using a server version of the system. So when you compile your co-registration dossier in iEuclid 6, then there are certain fields that are mandatory fields or sections, and certain sections that are, depending on your case, also mandatory. So you will see these in the slide. So in this case, we've selected a dossier template for a general case, meaning it's a full substance, it's not an intermediate, but if it would be an intermediate, you could also select a REACH registration member of joint submission intermediates case. So you can see that these sections were covered already earlier in the co-registration overview part, but you can see that these are the same sections as are required for EU REACH purposes. So you have a lot of sections under the general information part, so number 1, and then information under section 3, manufacture, use, and exposure. On top of this, you can then provide the guidance of safe use under section 11, depending on if you need to, and the lead registrant hasn't submitted it, and include, for example, your chemical safety report under section 13, the assessment report section, if the lead has not submitted it. And also, if you register intermediates, then you would include your appendix 3 document under the assessment report section. So I will not go into the details of compiling a dossier. I'll just show you an overview of what's required for, what fields are required for this effort. If you want to look at how to compile a dossier, there's a lot of guidance available on the ECHA, so the European Chemical Agency website, because the same guidance also applies for UK REACH purposes. So once you have created the co-registration dossier, so using essentially you created first a Euclid data set and then created a dossier from this data set, then and exported this data set out from this Euclid software into a file format, so a file on your computer, for example, then you are ready to go into comply with UK REACH to submit this co-registration dossier. And how this is done is that actually, if you go into the substance group and look at the substance details part, you can actually, under substance details, you can actually see that in this case, you have a registration dialog available. So by selecting this register, you will then be able to upload your Euclid dossier for your registration file containing your registration as compiled in the previous slide, and then go ahead in the process and submit it. And eventually you will also be greeted with a dialog saying that you first have to pay the HSE registration fee before it will be accepted by the HSE. This, we don't have screenshots on this yet because we have not progressed that far yet in the process. So that still remains to be seen. But it is a simple process in the comply with UK REACH system once you have the dossiers compiled. And I suspect the HSE fee invoice will be issued by an automated message into your email box. The inbox essentially that you define when you set up your comply with UK REACH IT system. So cost of registration, this will be a short one. So as we are already way past our timeline, but I did hint that this would be the case. We go a bit over time. So the work for creating the dossiers, internal resources, maybe using a service provider and so forth, will constitute certain part of the cost pie, if you will. The HSE part fee will of course be a big one, depending on the case, but we suspect that the letter of access cost will constitute most of the costs. Very much obviously dependent on the case and how many registrants there are sharing the costs and so forth. But maybe this could be like a overall, let's say, mean average value of the different cost distributions for co-registration cases. Just for you to keep in mind when budgeting and so forth. Okay, so now let's look at the action plan for co-registrants. This will be a quick one, and then a quick conclusion before going to the question and answer. So I see that we have quite a lot of questions already, so we have a bit of time to also answer those. So follow the discussions in the substance group. Your email will be your communication channel, so be aware what email you have there defined and so forth. When a lead registrant candidate nominates themselves, then you should select and support the lead registrant you think does the best job, and vote where need be. And then engage with the lead registrant to follow the process of the joint registration work and share information. It is very important that you are active on this part, because then the only way you are able to follow the progress to be active and even proactive. And very good always to document your discussions with the lead registrant in case of any issues in the future. And then you should verify that you have the same substance and the actual joint submission, and this is done by comparing the SIP, the substance identity profile, against your substance composition. But this should probably not be a big effort because you've already inquired for the substance. We suspect that the same substance identity will be used as you used for inquiry, albeit you need to check that you are fitting inside the boundary conditions, so into the SIP, so to speak. Participate in the data sharing where applicable, if you have data to share, and based on instructions from the lead registrant. And very important for co-registrants is to understand the scope of the submission. So whether what uses will be covered, is the chemical safety report included? If not, is the chemical safety report submitted by the lead? If not, will the lead then provide a template for you to compile yourself based on company information, or is it completely excluded, which means that you would have to do it, prepare the CSR yourself, and that is quite a lot of work. The same goes for the guidance of safe use. This is of course a much simpler set of information than the CSR, but anyway, good to understand whether it's included or not. Get access to the joint submission. So you need to sign most likely a substance group agreement, and then you need to purchase a letter of access once that is available, and you need to check with the lead registrant when this happens, so that you are quick on your feet when it is available to purchase it. Then you need to, of course, prepare your own dossier in IUCLID 6 and submit it to the HSE, and of course before that include a CSR and guidance of safe use where applicable, as discussed earlier. Then submit it to the HSE using the comply with UK REACH IT system, and of course do this by the applicable registration deadline. And the payment, of course, of the registration fee. And once you have paid it, only then will you get the registration number as issued by the HSE, if everything is okay. Then you need, of course, always to keep your UK REACH registration dossier, co-registration dossier up to date, and keep records of your compliance activities for at least 10 years. That was a quick run through of the action plan. And just to conclude, UK REACH has entered into force. We know this, but just to reiterate, transitional registration deadline apply depending on the substance type and the annual tonnages. So depending on these, you can already set a registration deadline for yourself. A joint submission must have a lead registrant, and a co-registrant must become a part of this joint submission. This seems to be twice there, sorry for that. And then you need to choose a reliable lead registrant that will do a good job. So this is why you should inquire soon, so that you can be part of the election process. And it's better to register sooner than later, and essentially register as soon as a letter of access becomes available, because it just takes time to do all the work that we looked at, and it's better just to not leave it to the last minute, learning from the past experience. And non-GB manufacturers, formulators should choose their professional only representative in the UK as soon as possible to take care of these, for example, the UK REACH co-registration effort. However, of course, first we have the doing notification deadline end of October this year. So if you haven't chosen your only representative, now is a good time to do that. And we're, of course, at REACH Law very happy to help you with those efforts. We are an only representative in the UK, in Great Britain. So if you need those type of services, we'll be happy to help, and please feel free to ask for a quotation. We will provide this quickly to you. at your request. Okay, so now finally coming to the last leg of this long webinar in the form of questions and answers. So if I can just check with my colleague Steve.
I'm here.
Do we have, yes, we have quite a few questions.
So Freddy has been
Yeah.
talking for a long time, so I'm going to lead on the first few whilst you get a drink, Freddy. I'm going to start with the ones we've received during the webinar today because I can see them in front of me. We're going to get through it as fast as possible. We'll do as many as we can as possible, but we will provide them in a written form later for everything we've received. So please do not worry about that. So I'm going to start with, we are a resin manufacturer in the EU. We used to have a toller manufacturing setup and sold products to UK. Now there is no use of these tollers and contracts have been terminated. The product is moved to our own plant. Can we still do the due-in and sell in the UK? The requirement for a due-in is that the recipient in the UK has bought the substances before and that they bought them in the 2019-2020 period. So provided the recipient in the UK bought those substances, then either they can do the due-in or you as an EU manufacturer can do the due-in through an only representative cited in the UK and cover that trade. The key is from the compliance the importer's point of view, because they're the ones with the compliance obligation. So provided those customers have received before, then yes, you can do that. The next one we have is, what do you mean by active trade? Well, active trade for due-in purposes, that is a downstream user importer notification, means that the Great Britain company bought the substance from some EU registered for source during 2019 or 2020. So provided that is true, then they can either do a due-in or a non-UK company can do it for them through an only representative, even if they then buy it from a different source. But the key is that the customer in the UK has bought them during that period of time. The next one we have is, if we have a substance without an EU REACH number, are we able to do a due-in? The substance was previously in the EU but lower than 1 tonne per year. Well, if it's below 1 tonne per year, then there is no compliance obligation anyway, and therefore there's no need for a due-in. But of course, if it goes over 1 tonne per year, there is a compliance obligation and a new registration will be needed. So that's the main point, is keep it below 1 tonne per year until you've got your registration in place. The next one we have is the registration deadline based on a 3-year average, maximum year, or the lowest volume before the deadline? Well, the definition is the same as EU REACH. That is, it's based on calendar year, 3-year average. But obviously, if you're going over 1 tonne per year for the first time, it really ought to be that first year that matters, even if the previous years were very low. If you're going over 1 tonne per year, then it's better just to get the registration done. But usually the volumes are done on a 3-year average per the EU. If we did not submit an inquiry, can we find somewhere in the UK web or on the ECHA website if the substance is already registered under UK REACH? Freddy, I do not know that. Do you know if there's a list of registrations in the UK? I assume it's too soon for that.
Yes, at least I haven't found any at the moment. So
okay.
I think there will be something in the long run, but at the moment, no.
Okay, thank you for that. Do we have to do a full registration if we have made an inquiry? Yes, but only if you are continuing to import or manufacture in the UK. An inquiry does not obligate you to follow through to the registration, but you need the registration if you want to continue to supply above 1 tonne per year in the relevant timeline. But the inquiry does not remove the obligation to register. It is simply the first step towards registration. If a company imports a substance, can they then act as importer and only representative in the same registrations? I'm going to say yes and no here. If you're an importer, then you're doing an importer registration. If you're an only representative, it's because you have been appointed by a non-Great Britain company, and that is arguably a different registration. You may be co-registrants in these two roles under the same legal entity, but essentially, I suppose it could be the same registration, but it would have to be demonstrably the same substance, and you have to have the appointment letter from the non-GB company to be an only representative. Is there anything you'd like to add to that, Fedi?
No, I think you covered it well enough.
Okay.
I have nothing to add.
Is my understanding correct that HSE fees apply to substances that don't have EU REACH registration? The main point about HSE fees is that they don't apply to substance registrations which are grandfathered. That is, it's a GB company and they're essentially transferring their EU registration into the UK system. If that is not true, then the registration fees apply. Okay, and obviously every company that imports or manufacturers needs a registration, irrespective of whether it has been registered already by somebody else. So it's not just the fees don't apply if it's got an EU registration. It's either grandfathered or the fees apply.
Yes. So I can take the next one, so you can rest your.
I was going to ask you to.
So the question is there a notion of affiliates, or do we need to pay for each legal entity, for example, having several in the UK? So yeah, this is a very good question, and as we've learned from EU REACH, the affiliates approach is not viewed well by the authorities, and it's actually contrary to the data sharing regulation that was applicable, or the EU data sharing regulation, which is also transposed into the UK legislation. So it means that, long story short, yes, each legal entity will need to pay for the HSE fees separately. They will also have to purchase letter of accesses, for example, separately, and so forth. So each legal entity manufacturing or importing or being an only representative will need to do this separately, and definitely will not recommend going through the developing a, let's say, a substance group agreement where you have affiliates mentioned, that those can be exempted from any subsequent letter of accesses. So each legal entity needs to pay their fair share of the joint registration effort. So
Okay.
That's a question of where does the doing fit into the story. If you have done this, is an inquiry still needed? So we covered the doing part separately in a separate webinar, so I invite you to have a look at that. But if you do submit the doing, you still need to submit an inquiry if you intend to register. So these are separate.
Yeah, I think that's important. I apologize for interrupting. If you intend to register, it may be you do the doing and someone else registers. Just because you've done the doing does not obligate you to register, provided obviously the registration is there if you continue to import, but it may be someone else. Therefore, there's no obligation, and the HSE don't know that you're the one that's going to ultimately register. So inquiry is necessary for registration, doing is not, but to benefit from the deferred timeline as a downstream user that has become an importer, you need to do the doing.
Yes, very good. We'll just take two more questions as we're really running out of time, and we will come back with answers to the rest of the questions. I believe we answered the questions that came by email before in the actual webinar, but we'll just take the next one. So there was a question about the lead registrant box being open in the substance group, and we actually inquired from the HSE on this particular issue, because they mentioned that it would be available from May 1st, and it's not there yet. And checking today in the morning, it was still not there. But HSE came back to us and said that it will be there later in June. So we will follow the situation. So the tick box is whereby the lead registrant can essentially take the lead registrant position if they have been elected by the substance group members to do so. So it's a technical feature, if you will.
And finally, the SVHC candidate list for the UK. If you search on the internet UK HSE SVHC, those three terms together, then you'll get there fairly fast. The SVHC candidate list in the UK is exactly as it was in the EU on the 31st of December. There is a slight divergence because the EU's had one or two since. So essentially, they diverge from the end of last December. So it's pretty much the same length. But the way to find it is go to the HSE website and search for SVHC, or just Google. You can get there. It's an Excel spreadsheet. You can get there fairly quickly. Okay.
Okay, as we are way past our end of the webinar, so I would just close it here and just come back to all of you with the answers to the other questions. So we'll provide a Q&A for this. Please hold us accountable if we do not provide it. So just wanting to thank you all for your attention, and sorry again for going a bit over time. And then, of course, thank you, Steve, for your help with this webinar. And as mentioned, if you need any support with UK REACH and any of the other EU REACH-like regulations globally, please feel free to contact us at any time. We'll be happy to help. So thank you very much for attending, and stay safe.